The TGV high-speed train slices through the French countryside at a velocity that blurs the world into a green and gold watercolor. But my mind was moving even faster, hurtling back through time. With every kilometer south from Paris, the gray, orderly geometry of the city dissolved, replaced by the sun-drenched, untamed beauty of Provence. And with it, the cool, professional shell of Elodie Dubois, archivist at the Archives Nationaux, began to melt away, leaving only what was underneath. Isa, my grandmother's name for me, a name that tasted of home. My grandmere, my Lola, had passed 2 weeks ago, a quiet, peaceful end to a long, vibrant life. I, her only remaining family, was now the sole inheritor and steward of her legacy. The old stone maws, the farmhouse that had been in our family for 2 centuries, nestled in the hills outside the village of Valoran. The purpose of my trip was grim to begin the long, painful process of sorting through a lifetime of memories. To begin to say goodbye, the moment I stepped off the small regional train in Valoran, the air changed. It was thick with the scent of lavender, thyme, and hot dust, the sound of 1,000 cicadas humming a lazy afternoon song. This place was my other life, a world away from the metallic tang of the Paris metro and the scent of old paper that clung to my clothes. This was the world my Lola had built. She was Filipina, my grandmother, a beautiful, fiery woman from Sibalam, Antique, who had met my French grandfather, a diplomat, in Manila after the war. She had come to France for love, a brave, exotic flower, transplanted into the ancient soil of Provence. And she had thrived, but she never lost her roots. Our family home, the Mas de Bois, was a testament to her beautiful, blended soul. From the outside, it was pure Provence, thick, honey-colored stone walls, faded blue shutters, a roof of curved terracotta tiles. But inside was a different story. As I pushed open the heavy oak door, the scent of my childhood washed over me. The faint, lingering aroma of my Lola's cooking, not just French stews, but the sharp, vinegary tang of adobo and the comforting scent of garlic rice. The living room, with its rustic wooden beams and stone hearth, was filled not with French antiques, but with dark, heavy, narrow wood furniture she had shipped over from the Philippines decades ago. Intricate capiz shell lanterns hung from the beams, casting a warm, pearlescent glow. On the mantelpiece, next to a faded photograph of my French grandfather, was a small carved santo, a wooden saint from a church in her home province. This house was a paradox. It was my French heritage, but it was my Filipino soul. It was my Lola, and now it was just quiet. The silence was a physical presence, a weight in the warm air. I dropped my bags in the entryway, the sound echoing in the stillness, and for the first time since her funeral, I let myself weep. The next few days were a blur of bittersweet archaeology. I moved through the house like a ghost, every object I touched unleashing a flood of memories. I found her old recipe books, the pages stained with soy sauce and olive oil, recipes for boeuf bourguignon written next to instructions for pancit molo. I found photo albums filled with black and white, pictures of her and my grandfather, young and impossibly glamorous, in Manila, in Paris, here in Valoran, and pictures of me, a small dark-haired girl, running laughing through the lavender fields that bordered our property. I forced myself to go into the village. It was both a comfort and a torment. Nothing had changed. Old Monsieur Clement was still behind the counter at the boulangerie, his mustache as white and flowery as ever. "Ah, Elodie," he exclaimed, his face breaking into a warm, wrinkled smile. "You have your grandmother's eyes." She was a fine woman, the soul of this village. We miss her dearly. Madame Renaud at the weekly market pressed a wheel of goat cheese into my hands. "For you, Sherry. Your Lola always said our cheese reminded her of the cheese from her home." Kesung Puri, she called it. These people, their memories, they were a part of the house, a part of my family's story. They were my community. They knew our history. It was a comforting thought, a feeling of being rooted in something deep and permanent. A feeling that I would soon learn was a complete and utter illusion. The talk of the town was the new mayor, Lucien Moreau. He was young, for a mayor, handsome in a slick, modern way, with a sharp suit and a smile that seemed to have been focus grouped for maximum appeal. He had been elected on a wave of optimism, a promise to bring a new future to Valoran. His big project was a plan to attract new investment, new tourism. That evening, there was a town meeting to unveil his grand proposal. Feeling a sense of civic duty and a desire to feel connected to the community again, I decided to go. The town hall was packed. The air was buzzing with an energy that was half excitement, half anxiety. Mayor Moreau took the stage, his charisma radiating through the room. He spoke of progress, of prosperity, of respecting the village's heritage while embracing the opportunities of the 21st century. He was a masterful speaker, his words painting a beautiful picture of a future where jobs were plentiful and the village thrived. And we have found the perfect partner to help us realize this dream, he announced, gesturing to a man in a crisp, expensive suit who had taken the stage with him. Mr. Dubois from the Elysian Resorts Group. My blood ran cold. Dubois, the same as my name. It was a common name, but still a strange coincidence. Mr. Dubois, a man with a face like a polished stone, stepped up to a large screen. Good evening, he said, his voice the smooth, placeless accent of international business. Elysian Resort specializes in creating world-class, five-star luxury experiences. And we believe Valoran is the perfect location for our next flagship resort and vineyard. An image flashed up on the screen behind him. It was a stunning, computer-generated rendering of a hyper-modern hotel complex. A sleek glass and steel structure with infinity pools, a spa, and rows upon rows of pristine grapevines. It was beautiful in a sterile corporate way. It had all the soul of an airport. Terminal. The Elysian Valoran, he announced, will bring over 200 jobs to this community. It will put your beautiful village on the international map. The crowd murmured, a sound of awe and approval. But I wasn't looking at the hotel. I was looking at the map behind it, the layout of the proposed resort. My heart started to hammer against my ribs. The hotel, the vineyard, the spa, they were all situated on a very familiar plot of land. A plot of land with a long, winding driveway and a distinctive cluster of cypress trees. A plot of land that was mine. The presentation ended to a roar of applause. Mayor Moreau was beaming, shaking hands, accepting congratulations. I felt dizzy, my mind reeling. This couldn't be real. It had to be a mistake. I pushed my way through the crowd until I was standing in front of him. Mayor Moreau, I said, my voice shaking slightly. He turned to me, his politician smile firmly in place. Ah, Mademoiselle Dubois, Elodie, isn't it? My deepest condolences on the passing of your grandmother. She was a treasure. Thank you, I managed to say. Mayor, the presentation, the map of the resort, that's my family's. Land, that's my house. His smile didn't falter. He placed a calming, paternalistic hand on my arm. Ah, yes. A beautiful property. A prime location. That's why it was chosen for the preliminary study. Preliminary, I asked, a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. It looked quite finalized. Oh, no, he said, shaking his head, his expression one of profound reassurance. That's just the developer's dream scenario, you understand. An artist's rendering. We are simply exploring all possibilities for the village's economic revitalization. Of course, he added, his eyes full of practiced sincerity. We would never proceed without the full cooperation of the landowners. Your family's legacy in Valoran is of the utmost importance. We would never disrespect that. He was so smooth, so convincing. He made my panic feel foolish, hysterical. So, you aren't planning on demolishing my home? I asked, wanting to hear him say it. Elodie, he said my name like we were old friends. Please, don't you worry about a thing. Your grandmother was a pillar of this community. Trust me, your home is safe. I left the town hall feeling confused, shaken, but slightly reassured. He had seemed so sincere. Surely no one could be that dishonest. Surely the community, the people who had known my Lola for 50 years, would never stand for it. I walked home under a sky full of stars, the scent of lavender heavy in the air. I stood on the porch of my beautiful, strange, stone and Kappa's shell house, the house that held my entire history, and I let myself believe the lie. I clung to the hope that a place, a memory, a legacy could not be bought and sold. It was a naive hope, and it would be a short-lived one. The mayor's reassurances were a soothing balm on a raw nerve, and I, a fool, let myself be soothed. For a few days, I lived in a state of willful ignorance. I focused on the house, on the bittersweet task of sorting through my grandmother's belongings. I swept the cool stone floors, polished the heavy narrow wood furniture until it shone, and tended to the small garden of herbs she had kept by the kitchen door. I told myself that Mayor Moreau was a man of his word. I told myself that the community, the people who had known and loved my Lola, would never allow her home to be bulldozed. I chose to believe in the power of memory, of legacy. It was a beautiful, sentimental, and catastrophically naive belief. The propaganda campaign began subtly. A week after the town meeting, a glossy flyer appeared in every mailbox in Valoran. It was from the mayor's office, titled A New Dawn for Valoran. It was filled with smiling photos of local business owners and glowing testimonials about the economic miracle the Elysian resort would bring. It spoke of jobs for the young, of increased tourism, of a revitalized town center, and in a small paragraph about overcoming the obstacles to progress, it mentioned the need to address certain dilapidated, unsafe structures in prime locations. It didn't name my house. It didn't have to. Then came the article in the local weekly paper, the Voix de Valoran. It was an op-ed penned by a concerned citizens committee, a group whose members were suspiciously anonymous. The article lamented the village's economic stagnation and pointed a finger at those who clung sentimentally to the past. It specifically mentioned the old Dubois estate, describing it as a sprawling, crumbling relic that was a fire hazard and an eyesore. Crumbling relic. The words were poison darts. My house was old, yes, it needed work. But it was not a ruin. It was strong, built of stone and hardwood, and the stubborn will of my ancestors. The article was a calculated act of character assassination, not against a person, but against a home. Against my home. The poison began to seep into the village well. The next time I went to the market, the mood had shifted. Madame Renaud was still polite, but the warmth was gone from her eyes. "It is a difficult situation, Elodie," she said, her voice low as she rubbed my cheese. "My son, he has to drive to Avignon for work, the resort. It would mean he could find a job here. He could stay." Monsieur Clement at the bakery was more direct. He wiped his floury hands on his apron and sighed. "Your grandmother, she was a great woman. But she is gone. The village must think of the living, of the future of our children." They were reciting the mayor's talking points, their own greed and desperation now cloaked in the noble language of civic progress. I saw the narrative taking hold. I was no longer Elodie Dubois, granddaughter of the beloved matriarch from the Philippines. I was now Mademoiselle Dubois from Paris, the selfish outsider, the keeper of a dusty relic who was standing in the way of their children's future. The betrayal was not a single clean cut. It was a slow, creeping infection. I knew then that I had to fight, but I was a historian, not a politician. My weapons were not economic arguments and slick presentations. My weapons were memory, sentiment, story. And so I planned my counteroffensive, an appeal not to their wallets, but to their hearts. I spent a week turning my home into a museum of memory. I went through every box, every trunk, every dusty album. I unearthed photographs I hadn't seen in years. A photo from the 1950s of my Lola, young and beautiful, serving food to the entire village during a festival right on our front lawn. A photo of my grandfather with a group of local men, all of them smiling, standing in front of the new well he had helped dig on the village green. Letters of thanks from neighbors my family had helped after a bad harvest in the 70s. I found my grandmother's journals, written in a beautiful flowing mix of French and her native Kinarea. I found a passage where she described her first lonely years in Valoran and how the women of the village had embraced her, teaching her how to cook with thyme and rosemary while she taught them how to make lumpia. She had written, "This house is not just stone. It is my heart, and it is filled with the kindness of this town. This is my home. This is where I belong." The words brought tears to my eyes. How could they forget? How could they betray the memory of the woman who had loved them so dearly? I decided to host an open house. I sent out handwritten invitations to every member of the town council and all our immediate neighbors. I called it an afternoon of memory. The day of the event, I cooked for 2 days straight. I made French classics my grandfather loved, but I also made the dishes of my Lola. I made a huge platter of lumpia Shanghai and a pot of chicken adobo whose vinegary, garlicky aroma filled the entire house. It was the scent of my childhood, the scent of her love. It was the scent of home they came. The mayor, the council members, my neighbors. They walked through my home, their faces polite, guarded masks. I had set up tables with the old photographs and letters. I walked them through, my voice trembling slightly as I told them the stories. This was the fate de la Lavandie. 1968, I said, pointing to a photo. Lola hosted it here every year. Look, Madame Renaud, that's you as a little girl, with the pigtails. She smiled, a brief, fleeting warmth in her eyes. And this, I said, my voice catching, is from my grandmother's journal. I've translated it from the Kinarea she wrote in. It's about all of you, about how you welcomed her. I read the passage aloud. I saw flickerings of emotion. An elderly councilman dabbed his eye with a handkerchief. My next-door neighbor, a man who had known me since I was born, placed a hand on my shoulder. Your grandmother was a saint, Elodie. We all know that. And how can you even consider this? I asked, my voice pleading. This house isn't just a building. It's a part of our shared history. It's a part of your history. It's my Lola's heart, please. Don't let them tear it down. I served them the food. They ate the lumpia, they drank the wine, they praised my cooking. They thanked me for the lovely afternoon, and then they left. As I watched Mayor Moreau get into his car, he gave me a small, pitying smile. It was the smile of a predator that knows its prey is already dead. I knew then that I had failed. I had brought them a feast of memories, and all they had seen was the real estate. My appeal to their hearts was no match for the appeal the developer had made to their wallets. The betrayal was almost complete. The final town hall meeting was scheduled for the last day of July, Thursday, July 31st, 2025. The air in the room was thick and hostile. It was not a meeting. It was a sentencing. The room was packed, not with the old-timers who remembered my grandmother, but with younger families, their faces a mixture of hope and greed, all of them bussed in and organized by the mayor's office. They looked at me with open resentment. I was the obstacle, the woman from Paris, selfishly standing in the way of their new jobs. Their bright future. The developer, Mr. Dubai, gave another one of his slick presentations, this time filled with specific, dazzling numbers about tax revenue and job creation. Then Mayor Moreau took the stage. He was magnificent. A true artist of manipulation. He started by praising my family. He called my Lola a beloved icon of Valorn's past. He said he understood my sentimental attachment to the old house. It was all a gentle, respectful prelude to the kill, but we cannot let our love for the past mortgage our children's future. He boomed, his voice ringing with passion. This project, this is not just a resort, it is a lifeline. It is a promise to our young people that they do not have to leave Valorant to find work. It is a promise of prosperity for every single family in this room. The crowd roared its approval. Mademoiselle Dubois has a beautiful home in Paris, he continued, turning his gaze on me, his expression now one of sad, paternalistic disappointment. She does not live here. She does not face the same struggles that you, the hardworking people of this village, face every day. I ask you, is it fair for one person's nostalgic hobby to stand in the way of progress for an entire community? The room erupted in applause. He had painted me as a rich, out-of-touch elitist, and they had bought it completely. Then it was my turn to speak. My hands were trembling as I approached the podium. I had a prepared speech, full of more stories, more memories. But as I looked out at their hard, unforgiving faces, I knew it was useless. They weren't listening. They didn't want to remember. They had already made their choice. So I threw my speech away. This house, I said, my voice shaking with a rage I could no longer contain, has stood on that land for 200 years. It has sheltered my family in times of war and in times of peace. It has opened its doors to this village in times of celebration and in times of need. It is more than just stone and wood. It is a testament to a life well lived, a life of generosity. My grandmother's life. I looked directly at the mayor. And you want to bulldoze it? You want to replace it with a monument to greed. You tell these people this is progress, but it is not progress. It is cultural vandalism, and you are not a leader. You're a salesman. My words were met with a wave of angry boos and jeers. Mayor Moreau simply smiled his pitying smile. My time was up. The vote was a formality, a public execution. The council president called the roll. Monsieur Dubois of the council? No relation to me, a cruel irony. Oui. Madame Giroux? Oui. Monsieur Faber? Oui. On and on it went. Each, yes, a hammer blow. These were people whose children I had played with. People who had come to my grandparents' funerals. People who had eaten my Lola's food. One by one, they chose the promise of a stranger's money over the history of a neighbor. The final vote was unanimous. The motion to seize my property through eminent domain and proceed with the demolition was passed. The gavel fell, a sharp final crack that sealed my fate. The room erupted in cheers and applause, a celebration of my defeat. I stood there, alone, in a sea of my smiling, triumphant neighbors. The betrayal was no longer creeping, it was complete, and it was absolute. Start writing Act 3. The sound of the gavel falling was the sound of a door slamming shut on my past. I walked out of the town hall that night, the celebratory cheers of my neighbors echoing behind me like a funeral dirge. They were celebrating my erasure. I stumbled home through the dark, quiet streets of Valerian, a ghost in my own village. Each familiar stone, each shuttered window, felt like an accusation. I spent that night in a state of hollowed-out shock. I wandered through the rooms of my house, my home, a condemned woman on death row. I ran my hands over the cool, smooth, narrow wood of the dining table my Lola had cherished. I touched the delicate, translucent panes of the Kappa's shell lanterns, a piece of her Filipino home here in the heart of France. I saw her life everywhere. I saw her story, our story, and the town had just voted to bulldoze it into dust for the sake of a swimming pool and a five-star restaurant. Grief was a physical weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I collapsed onto Anne, old armchair, the one where she used to sit and tell me stories about her childhood in Cyberlom, and I finally let the full, crushing weight of my defeat wash over me. It was over. I had lost, but as the first pale light of dawn crept through the windows, something inside me shifted. The grief, so heavy and suffocating, began to burn. It was a slow, quiet chemical reaction. The heartbreak began to calcify into something hard. The sadness began to sharpen into a fine, cold point. I am a historian, an archivist. My entire life is dedicated to the principle that the past matters, that stories deserve to be saved. And they thought they could just erase mine. I looked at the photograph on the mantelpiece, my Lola, young and defiant, and my French grandfather, his eyes full of adoration for her. They were fighters. She had crossed the world for love. I didn't know as much about his story, but I knew they had not raised a granddaughter who would surrender. The local fight was lost. I had tried to appeal to their hearts, but their hearts had been sold to the highest bidder. A conventional legal battle would be hopeless. The mayor had the full backing of the council, and the developer had lawyers who could bury me in motions for years. But there was another way, a higher authority, an appeal not to law, but to history itself, monument historique, National Historic Landmark status. The thought was a lightning strike in the darkness of my despair. It was an insane long shot. The process took years, sometimes decades. It required mountains of paperwork and, most importantly, irrefutable proof of outstanding historical or artistic value. I had a demolition order hanging over my head that would likely be executed in a matter of weeks. But it was the only path left. My grief had found a new name, and its name was resolve. I moved through the house with a new, frantic energy. I packed a small suitcase with clothes, but my main focus was on a large, old leather trunk from the attic my grandmother's personal archives. Her diaries, her photo albums, her letters. Everything I had tried to use to appeal to the town. Their hearts were close to it, but maybe, just maybe, it held a clue, a thread I could pull. At sunrise, I was in my car, the trunk loaded in the back. I didn't look back at the house as I drove away. I was no longer a sentimental granddaughter fleeing a painful memory. I was an archivist on a mission, and my battlefield was waiting for me in Paris. The Archives Nationaux of France is a quiet, secular cathedral dedicated to the preservation of memory. The air inside is cool and smells of paper, leather, and time itself. It had been my workplace, my professional sanctuary. Now it was my last hope. I bypassed my own office and went straight to the public reading room, taking a seat among the visiting scholars and PhD students. I was one of them now, a researcher with a single, desperate query. The clock was ticking. Are you from a friend? In the local planning office that the final demolition order would be processed and signed within 60 days. I had less than 2 months to perform a historical miracle. I started with the official records, the land deeds, the cadastral surveys of Valeran. For days, I hunched over massive, crumbling books and scrolled through endless reels of microfilm. The search was frustrating, a slow, methodical chipping away at a wall of bureaucratic indifference. The records were all maddeningly consistent. The property was listed as Mas de Bois. Its owner, my great-grandfather, Jean-Pierre Dubois. His occupation, agriculture, farmer, There was nothing about its construction, no mention of a famous architect, no record of any notable events ever taking place there. According to the official history of France, my home was just an old, unimportant farmhouse. Every document was a dead end, another brick in the wall of my despair. After a week of fruitless searching, I felt my resolve begin to fray. I was exhausted, living on coffee and adrenaline. The weight of the deadline was crushing me. That night, back in my small Parisian apartment, I opened my grandmother's trunk, more for comfort than for any real hope of a clue. I needed to feel connected to her, to the woman from Cybalom whose strength I was trying so desperately to channel. I pulled out her journals. I had read them before, but this time I read them with a different purpose. I wasn't just looking for memories, I was looking for a key. Most of it was what I remembered, her early struggles with the French language, her joy at planting a vegetable garden that reminded her of home, her love for my grandfather. But then I found a series of entries from the early 1950s. Jean-Pierre's Quiet Tonight, she had written in her elegant, looping English. The memories of the war are a ghost that still visits him. He looks at the walls of this house, and I know he is not seeing her home. He is seeing another time. He calls it the station. He says this house kept many secrets during the dark years, secrets he can never speak of. He tells me I am like this house, that from the outside I look fragile, but my foundations are strong enough to withstand a war. My heart began to beat faster. The dark years. The station. Secrets. My grandfather had been a farmer. What secrets could a farmer's house hold? I dug deeper into the trunk. Underneath a stack of embroidered linens, I found a small wooden box inlaid with mother of pearl, a piece of Filipino craftsmanship. Inside were my grandfather's things. His military service medals from the First World War, a faded photograph of him as a young man, and a small leather-bound notebook, his notebook. I had never seen it before. I opened it. It was a farm ledger. Records of grape harvests, notations on weather, prices of feed. It was exactly the kind of thing a farmer would keep. I almost closed it, my disappointment a sharp, bitter taste. But then a few pages caught my eye. They were different. The entries were not about crops. They were lists of names, mostly English-sounding. Next to the names were dates, and then a single word. Arrive, arrived, or parti, departed. And next to some, a strange notation, a small hand-drawn bird and flight dot, and then I saw the code name, repeated over and over. A name that made no sense in a French farm ledger, but made perfect sense to the grandson of a woman from Cybalom. Operation Amihan. Amihan, the Tagalog word for the cool northeast monsoon. A word my grandmother would have known. A code name she would have suggested. It wasn't a farm ledger, it was a logbook. I was back in the archives the next morning before the doors even opened, my grandfather's notebook clutched in my hand like a holy relic. I was no longer searching for the history of a house. I was searching for the history of a man, of a hero. I requisitioned the declassified records of the French resistance for the Provence region. Box after dusty box. I scanned documents, my eyes burning, my fingers stained with the dust of history. I was looking for a name, Jean-Pierre Dubois, or a code name, Amihan. For days, nothing. Just endless reports of sabotage, of small skirmishes, of names and places that meant nothing to me. The deadline loomed. The demolition order was being processed. I was running out of time. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A box of recovered intelligence files from the British Special Operations Executive, the SOE, the agency, that had worked with the French resistance. The files were a list of safe houses used to shelter downed Allied pilots before they could be exfiltrated to Spain. The list was organized by region. I scrolled through the microfilm, my heart pounding. Provence, Vaucluse. Valoran, and there it was. Safe house designation, Amahan. Location, La Vieux Maz Pres de Cypress, the old farmhouse near the cypress. Tree, proprietor J.P. Dubois, agriculture. Status, highly reliable. Secured 14 Allied personnel, 1,943, 1,944. I let out a small choked gasp. The librarian at the next desk gave me a stern look. I didn't care. I found it. The official, undeniable cross-reference proof. My grandfather wasn't just a farmer. He was a resistant. And my home wasn't just a farmhouse. It was a station on an underground railroad that saved the lives of 14 Allied airmen. It was a headquarters for Operation Amahan pulling on. That one thread, the entire tapestry unraveled. I found after-action reports from rescued pilots that mentioned the brave farmer and his fierce, beautiful wife who had sheltered them. I found a commendation signed by Charles de Gaulle himself, posthumously awarding my great-grandfather the Médaille de la Résistance. I found maps where my home was marked with the secret symbol of the resistance. I spent the next 48 hours in a frenzy, scanning, printing, authenticating. I built my case, my petition. I wrote a detailed historical narrative, weaving together my grandfather's logbook, my grandmother's diary entries, and the official military records. It was the most important piece of historical research I had ever done. It was the story of my family, a story of quiet, humble heroism, a story that had been waiting for me to find it. I submitted the petition to the Ministry of Culture, a thick binder of evidence that was as irrefutable as it was astonishing. I had no idea if it would be enough. I had no idea if it would be in time. But as I walked out of the government building and into the Paris evening, I felt a sense of peace. I had done everything I could. I had unearthed the truth. My house had a story to tell, a secret it had kept for 80 years, and now I had finally given it a voice. The days following the submission of my petition were a unique form of torture. The frantic energy of the chase was gone, replaced by the slow, grinding agony of waiting. I would wake up each morning in my small Paris apartment with a jolt of adrenaline, my first thought being the house. Then the helplessness would set in. The fate of my home, my history, was no longer in my hands. It was a file on someone's desk in the Ministry of Culture, a stack of paper buried in a bureaucratic avalanche. I tried to go back to my job at the archives, to lose myself in the comforting, dusty order of other people's histories, but it was impossible. I would sit at my desk, cataloging 18th century Parisian census records, and my mind would be 1,000 kilometers away in Provence, picturing a bulldozer idling at the end of our driveway. The 60-day clock was ticking, a relentless countdown to demolition. I called Madame Renaud at the bakery every few days, under the pretense of just checking in. Her voice was always full of a sad, guilty pity. They put the demolition contract out for tender, Elodie, she told me one afternoon, her voice a low whisper over the phone. The mayor is moving very fast. He wants to have the groundbreaking for the resort before the autumn rains. Every update was another twist of the knife. He wasn't just waiting for the legal process to play out. He was creating an air of inevitability, ensuring that by the time the demolition order was signed, the contracts would be in place. The machinery would be ready, and any last-minute appeal would be futile. He was erasing my home in the present, tense, even while it still stood. The waiting was no longer passive. It was a race, and I was losing. Some nights, the despair was so thick I could barely breathe. I felt so utterly alone, a single, quiet archivist against a corrupt politician and a multi-million-euro development corporation. In those moments of crushing doubt, I would turn, as I always did, to my grandmother. I would open the old leather trunk and pull out her diaries. If I couldn't save her house, I could at least spend time with her memory. This time, I didn't just read her early entries about France. I went deeper to the journals she kept in the 1960s and 70s, where she began to write more about her own past as if needing to record the story of her first home before it faded completely. She wrote of Cybelum, not the vague, nostalgic Cybelum of her bedtime stories to me, but a place of grit and shadow and extraordinary courage. She wrote about the war. July 1943, one entry began. The ink faded, but the French still precise. Jean-Pierre was out late again last night. The station was active. A young Canadian boy with kind eyes and a broken arm. When I was cleaning his wounds, he asked me if I was ever afraid. I wanted to tell him about my own war. I wanted to tell him that fear is a familiar ghost. My own war? I read on, my heart pounding. He reminds me of the boys from my town who went up into the mountains of Panay, my own cousin, to mess. They were not soldiers. They were farmers, fishermen, students. But when the Japanese came, they became fighters. They had no uniforms, no proper guns, just old rifles and sharpened bolo knives and a fire in their hearts. They were the Visayan guerrillas. My father, his own father, would help smuggle rice and medicine up to their hidden camps. He would say, to be neutral in the face of a monster is to side with the monster. I sat bolt upright. My Filipino great-grandfather, he had been a part of the resistance too. My grandmother, my Lola, came from a family of fighters. This wasn't just in my French blood. It was in my Filipino blood too. I devoured the pages. She wrote about the terror of the Japanese occupation, but also about the incredible, stubborn resilience of her community. She described the secret networks, the whispers that passed through the market, the quiet, defiant acts of sabotage. She painted a picture of a people who, with very little, had fought back against an overwhelming force. She was writing about her home in the Philippines, but she could have been writing about her new home in France. Jean-Pierre does not know that I know the full extent of his work. She wrote in another entry, he thinks he protects me by not speaking of it, but I see the men who come in the dead of night. I see the fear in their eyes, and I see the hope when they leave. I boil the bandages. I make the soup. I keep the secrets. This is my war too. We are two halves of the same story. My brave French farmer and I. He fights for his land. I fight for his men. And we both fight for this house, this Amihan station, this small island of hope in a dark sea, Amihan. The name she had, given their secret operation. It was a piece of her home, a piece of Cybelum, secretly embedded in the heart of the French resistance. This house was not just a French historical site, it was a nexus. A place where two different histories, two different stories of quiet, fierce resistance against tyranny had met and merged. This was the legacy they had built together. My fight to save this farmhouse in Provence was no longer just about preserving my French heritage. It was about honoring my Filipino one, too. The house was not just my grandfather's, it was hers. The thought didn't just give me strength, it gave me a new fire. A fire as hot and righteous as the Provence sun. A week later, a formal, cream-colored envelope arrived from the Ministry of Culture. My hands trembled as I opened it. It was not the news I had hoped for. Dear Mademoiselle Dubois, the letter began, polite and bureaucratic. We have reviewed your preliminary petition regarding the property known as Mas Dubois in Valeron. The evidence you have submitted is compelling and historically interesting. However, the personal nature of the documents, family diaries, and an unverified logbook does not meet the stringent standards required for an emergency declaration of a monument historique. To justify such an extraordinary measure, we would require direct, verifiable, third-party evidence of the property's historical significance. We appreciate your diligence in this matter. It was a polite, bureaucratic death sentence. Interesting, but not enough. The demolition could proceed. For a moment, I felt the darkness return, the crushing weight of defeat. I had failed. But then I looked at my grandmother's journal, still open on my desk. To be neutral in the face of a monster is to side with the monster. I was not neutral. And I was not done fighting that third-party evidence. The words echoed in my mind. The ministry didn't trust the family's stories. They needed an official voice. The rescued pilots. The names in my grandfather's logbook. They were the key. My research began again, but this time it was a frantic, desperate sprint. I lived in the archives, fueled by a new urgency. I cross-referenced the names from my grandfather's logbook with every Allied military database I could get my hands on, French, British, Canadian. I found a few of them, but their service records were sparse, with no mention of their evasion in France. Another dead end. I was on my last thread of hope. The Americans. My grandfather's logbook listed 3 American names. One of them had a small annotation next to it, D-17, Jam Blessy. Wounded leg. I shifted my search to the U.S. National Archives, accessing their digital records. I searched for declassified reports from the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, the American precursor to the CIA that had worked with the resistance. I searched for mission reports, for lists of downed airmen. The hours blurred into days. My eyes burned from staring at microfilm readers, and then I found it. It was a file buried deep in a collection titled E&E Reports, European Theater of Operations, Evasion and Escape. It was a standard post-rescue debriefing report. The name on the report was First Lieutenant Robert Miller, Bombardier, U.S. 8th Air Force. His B-17 had been shot down over occupied France in the spring of 1944. I scrolled through the dry military jargon of the report, my heart pounding. He described being pulled from the wreckage by local farmers. He described being hidden for weeks, moved from one safe house to another. And then he described the final, crucial stop before his escape over the Pyrenees. I was taken to a final safe house in the countryside of Provence, a large stone farmhouse near the village of Valoran, the typewritten report read. The location was operated by a local farmer, a former French army veteran named Jean-Pierre Dubois. Mr. Dubois was a man of few words, but immense courage. I had sustained a shrapnel wound to my leg, which had become infected. His wife, a young woman from the Philippines, was a miracle. She had no formal medical training, but she cleaned and dressed my wound with local herbs and kept the fever down. She was as brave as any soldier I have ever met. For 10 days, they hid me in their cellar. The farmhouse, which they called Amihan Station, was a key link in the local network. I believe I owe my life to the quiet farmer and his brave Filipino wife. I printed the page, my hands shaking so hard I could barely hit the button. I had it, the smoking gun. The direct, official third-party testimony from a decorated American officer. And he hadn't just mentioned my grandfather. He had mentioned my Lola. He had seen her not just as a wife, but as a partner in the fight. Her quiet work of boiling bandages and making soup, it was as much a part of the resistance as my grandfather's secret meetings. It was her war too. I wasn't just saving a French farmhouse anymore. I was saving a Filipino nurse's infirmary. I was saving a testament to a love story that had spanned oceans and survived a world war. I was saving their house. I raced through the archives, making certified copies, getting the documents authenticated. I worked for 36 straight hours, not sleeping, not eating. I compiled a new petition, a supplement to my first. At the front, I placed the sworn testimony of First Lieutenant Robert Miller. I wrote a new cover letter, my words no longer just pleading, but burning with the fire of this new, complete truth. I walked to the Ministry of Culture, and hand-delivered the package myself. I gave it to the clerk, a young man who looked at me with bored indifference. He had no idea of the bomb I had just placed in his hands. As I walked out into the streets of Paris, I felt a profound sense of calm. The frantic energy was gone. I had done everything I could. I had unearthed the secrets. I had told their story. Now it was up to the ghosts of the past to fight for their own future. The silence from the Ministry of Culture was a living entity. It was a malevolent presence that followed me through the echoing halls of the archives, sat with me in my lonely apartment, and whispered doubts in my ear as I tried to sleep. Days bled into a week, then two. My petition, the binder that contained all my hope and all my history, had disappeared into the maw of French bureaucracy. I had fired my last best shot, and in return I had received nothing. Then the formal notice arrived. It was not from the ministry, but from the municipality of Valoran. It was a single cold sheet of paper. An order of demolition. The date was set, September 30th. I had 4 weeks until my home, and the legacy it represented would be turned into a pile of rubble. There was no victory. There was no last-minute miracle. There was only the quiet, grinding finality of defeat. I had unearthed a history of heroes, and it had not been enough. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't let the house die alone. I booked a train ticket back to Provence. It was not a journey of hope like my first trip home. It was a funeral march. I was going home to bear witness to the end of my world, to stand vigil as my family's. History was erased from the earth. I packed a small black dress. It seemed appropriate. The last night in the house was the longest of my life. I didn't sleep. I walked through the rooms, touching the walls, memorizing the way the moonlight fell across the old stone floor. I sat at the heavy, narrow wood table, running my hands over the carvings, imagining my Lola sitting across from me. I tried to feel her strength, her defiant spirit. I tried to draw on the courage of my French grandfather, the man who had faced down a fascist occupation from within these very walls. But I felt nothing, only a profound, bottomless sorrow. I had failed them. I had failed their house. The quiet archivist had fought a battle against men of money and power, and she had lost. I fell asleep in the old armchair in the living room, the scent of lavender and old memories, a comforting, tragic shroud. The morning of September 30th dawned bright and cruelly beautiful. The sky over Provence was a perfect cloudless blue. The air was crisp with the first hint of autumn. It was a day for living, not for dying. They arrived at 9 o'clock. The sound came first a low, guttural rumble that shook the old house to its foundations. I went to the window. 2 enormous yellow bulldozers were crawling up my driveway, their metal treads chewing up the gravel path. Behind them was a flatbed truck carrying a crane with a wrecking ball. They were not just demolishing a house. They were bringing an army to conquer it. I walked out onto the front porch and sat on the top step, a cup of coffee clutched in my trembling hands. I would not hide. I would not scream. I would watch. I would be the last witness. Soon, the other cars arrived. Mayor Lucien Moreau pulled up in his shiny black sedan, looking triumphant in a crisp polo shirt. Mr. Dubo, the developer, was with him, his face a mask of cold corporate satisfaction. A van from the local news station pulled in behind them, a reporter and a cameraman spilling out, eager to capture the birth of progress. The villagers began to gather at the end of the driveway, a small, silent crowd of onlookers. I recognized their faces, Madame Renaud, Monsieur Clement, my neighbors. Some looked excited, their eyes gleaming with the promise of the resort. Others looked down at their feet, a flush of guilt on their faces. They were all complicit. They were all here to watch the execution they had voted for. Mayor Moreau walked across the lawn towards me. his politician smile firmly in place. It was the most despicable expression I had ever seen. "Elodie," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "A sad day, but also a hopeful one. The end of one era, the beginning of a new, more prosperous one for Valoran." "Spare. Mere speeches, Mayor," I said, my voice quiet but steady. "You have what you wanted. Just get it over with." "I'm afraid I have to ask you to vacate the premises," he said, the smile tightening slightly. "The demolition crew has their orders." "I'm not going anywhere," I replied, taking a slow sip of my coffee. "This is still my home. I will stay until the very last moment." His face hardened. The mask of the charming public servant slipped, revealing the petty tyrant underneath. "Don't be difficult, mademoiselle. This is happening. You lost. Now please step aside." The foreman of the demolition crew approached, a large man with a weary face. "Mayor, we are ready to proceed on your order." Moreau looked at me, then at the news camera, then back at me. He was savoring his moment of victory. He opened his mouth to give the order, the command that would shatter my world, but the words never came. Instead, another sound broke the morning quiet. It was the sound of a different kind of engine. Not the growl of a bulldozer, but the smooth, powerful purr of a luxury sedan. A dark blue Peugeot, sleek and official, with a small tricolor flag emblem on the fender, was speeding up the driveway. Parting the assembled crowd like the Red Sea dot, the car stopped behind the mayor's. The driver's side door opened, and a dame woman in her 60s stepped out. She was impeccably dressed in a gray Chanel suit, her silver hair styled in a severe, elegant chignon. She radiated an aura of immense, unshakable authority. She was not from Valoran. She was from Paris. She was from the government. She strode across the lawn, ignoring the mayor completely, and walked directly towards me on the porch. She was followed by 2 assistants carrying a briefcase and a heavy, cloth-wrapped object. "Mademoiselle Elodie Dubois?" she asked, her voice crisp and clear. "Yes," I whispered, my heart beginning a frantic, hopeful pounding against my ribs. She gave me a small, professional smile. "My name is Genevieve Martin. I am the Deputy Director of the National Historical Commission. I am here on behalf of the Minister of Culture." Behind me, I heard Mayor Moreau let out a small, strangled sound. "Mademoiselle Martin," he stammered, rushing forward. "I am Mayor Moreau. I believe there is some mistake. This property has been legally expropriated for a municipal development project." Director Martin turned her gaze on him. It was a look of such profound, dismissive contempt that the mayor physically recoiled. "There's no mistake, Monsieur le Maire," she said, her voice like Arctic ice. "There is, however, a new legal designation for this property, which supersedes any and all municipal orders." She turned to her assistant, who opened the briefcase and produced a rolled-up scroll tied with a red, white, and blue ribbon. Director Martin unrolled it with a snap. It was an official decree, by the authority vested in me by the Minister of Culture and the Republic of France, she announced, her voice ringing across the silent lawn, and based on overwhelming and newly discovered evidence of this site's profound significance to the history of the French resistance during the Second World War. I do hereby declare this property, the Dubois farmstead, also known to history as Amiens Station, a monument historique of France, effective immediately. The silence was absolute. The bulldozers were silent. The crowd was silent. The only sound was the song of the cicadas. This property and all its structures, the director continued, her eyes boring into the mayor, are now under the full and permanent protection of the national government. To alter or damage it in any way is a federal crime. I suggest you tell your men to turn off their machines. She then turned to her other assistant, who unwrapped the object he was carrying. It was a heavy, beautiful bronze plaque. The official plaque of a monument, HISTORIQUE. The mayor's face was a ruin. The color had drained from it, leaving a pasty gray mask of pure impotent fury. The developer, Mr. Dubois, was already on his phone, his face a thundercloud, no doubt speaking to his very expensive lawyers. The news crew, realizing they had stumbled upon a far better story, turned their camera away from the bulldozers and onto the mayor's collapsing face. Director Martin and her team walked up the steps to the porch. "With your permission, mademoiselle?" She asked me. I could only nod, tears streaming down my face as the mayor and the developer and the entire village watched. They ceremoniously, officially, installed the plaque on the stone wall next to my front door. The sound of the drill biting into the 200-year-old stone was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of permanence, the sound of victory. The demolition crew packed up and left without another word. The crowd of villagers slowly, silently dispersed, their faces a mixture of shock and shame. The mayor and the developer got in their cars and sped away, their multi-million-euro dream dead and buried. I was left alone on the porch with Director Martin. "Your research was impeccable, Mademoiselle Dubois," she said, the professional severity in her eyes softening into a genuine warmth. "You have done your family and your country a great service. This house will stand for another 200 years. She shook my hand and then departed, leaving me in the quiet of my miraculous victory. I stood there for a long time, my hand resting on the cool, solid bronze of the plaque. It was real. It was permanent. The house was safe. My Lola's home was safe. I looked at the name engraved on the plaque, Amahan Station, the secret Filipino heart of this French place of heroes, and I knew what I had to do next. The revenge was complete, but the story was not. The first exhibit inside the newly protected Monument Historique would not be about my French grandfather. It would be about my grandmother. It would be the story of the brave, fierce woman from Sibalom who crossed the world, loved a hero, and became one herself. This house would no longer be a secret. It would be a testament, not just to one history, but to two. My history, the story of our family. For Lola, and for the first time in months, I smiled. A real, true, and triumphant smile.